Aristotle warned that when direction is absent, people substitute intensity for purpose. They work harder, move faster, and demand more of themselves, believing acceleration will produce clarity. Instead, it produces friction. Without an organizing aim, increased effort only amplifies confusion. Activity multiplies, but meaning does not. This explains why modern life, despite unprecedented convenience and opportunity, feels internally unstable. Choice has expanded faster than judgment. People are surrounded by options, but lack criteria. When everything is possible, nothing feels necessary. Aristotle would not have seen this as freedom, but as disorientation. A coherent life requires hierarchy. Some goals must be higher than others. Without this structure, trivial aims compete with essential ones, and attention becomes evenly distributed across what does not deserve equal weight. Clarity emerges not by eliminating options, but by ranking them according to what contributes most to human flourishing. Aristotle called this practical wisdom, the capacity to see what matters in a given situation and act accordingly. It is not theoretical knowledge, but cultivated perception. It allows a person to recognize which efforts are worth sustaining and which should be abandoned, not because they are easy or difficult, but because they are aligned or misaligned with a life well lived. This is why reflection alone is insufficient. Insight that is not embodied fades quickly. Direction must be reinforced through action, tested against reality, and adjusted through experience. Over time, a feedback loop forms. Action clarifies values. Values refine action. Life begins to cohere. Once alignment is established, many problems dissolve rather than disappear. Uncertainty remains, but it becomes navigable. Sacrifice remains, but it becomes chosen. Even failure changes character. It becomes information rather than indictment. When effort serves a clear end, setbacks educate instead of exhaust. The aim of this work, then, is not to eliminate dissatisfaction, but to make it intelligible. Properly understood, dissatisfaction becomes a signal, not of inadequacy, but of misdirection. When attention is reordered and effort aligned, the same life, with the same demands, can feel fundamentally different. Aristotle's insight endures because it addresses what does not change: human nature. We flourish not by doing more, but by doing what fits. And fit is achieved only when action, reason, and purpose are brought into deliberate alignment. Chapter 1. Everything in life aims at something. Aristotle called the highest organizing aim the final end, that for the sake of which everything else is chosen. Without such an end, life becomes a series of provisional decisions, each reasonable in isolation but incoherent as a whole. People pursue comfort today, achievement tomorrow, pleasure the next, never pausing to ask which of these should govern the others. The result is not freedom, but drift. This is why Aristotle insisted that the highest end must be comprehensive and stable. It cannot be something easily lost, outsourced, or exhausted. Wealth fails because it is always a means to something else. Status fails because it depends on the opinions of others. Pleasure fails because it is episodic and reactive. None can bear the weight of organizing an entire life. What Aristotle proposed instead was eudaimonia, not happiness as mood, but flourishing as activity. It is a way of living rather than a state to be achieved. A flourishing life is one in which human capacities are exercised well over time, in accordance with reason. This gives the highest end a distinctive character. It is not possessed, but enacted. Once this end is understood, confusion becomes diagnosable. When a person feels pulled in opposing directions, the question is no longer, what do I feel like doing? But which action serves the life I am trying to live? This reframes decision-making. Choices are evaluated not by comfort or intensity, but by alignment. Aristotle emphasized that this clarity is not instantaneous. The highest end is not discovered through a single insight, but refined through experience, reflection, and correction. One begins with rough outlines rather than perfect definitions. Over time, as actions accumulate, understanding sharpens. Direction becomes clearer because it has been tested. Importantly, this framework does not eliminate lower goods. Rest, pleasure, recognition, and security all retain their place. The error lies not in valuing them, but in allowing them to rule. When properly ordered, they support the highest end rather than compete with it. Pleasure refreshes effort. Rest restores capacity. Recognition confirms contribution without defining it. In this way, Aristotle's ethics is not restrictive, but liberating. It does not demand the suppression of desire, but its education. Desire becomes an ally of reason rather than its adversary. The soul gains coherence, and with coherence comes energy. When effort is unified by a clear end, life regains momentum. Actions reinforce rather than undermine one another. Progress becomes visible because it is measured against a stable standard. What once felt like strain begins to feel like construction. The slow, demanding, but meaningful work of building a life that makes sense. Chapter 2. Happiness. As flourishing, not feeling, Aristotle's account also explains why pleasure, when pursued directly, often becomes hollow. Pleasure functions best as a byproduct, not a goal. When it is elevated to the highest end, it loses its grounding and becomes unstable. The pursuit of pleasure demands constant novelty, yet novelty cannot sustain meaning. What satisfies briefly soon dulls, requiring ever greater stimulation. The soul becomes dependent rather than strengthened. Flourishing avoids this trap by rooting satisfaction in excellence rather than sensation. Excellence endures because it is cultivated. Skills deepen, judgment sharpens, character stabilizes. These developments accumulate over time, creating a life that feels progressively more coherent rather than increasingly frantic. Aristotle understood that lasting fulfillment emerges not from consumption, but from formation. This is also why flourishing is inseparable from virtue. Virtue for Aristotle is not moral purity, but functional excellence, the capacity to respond well to the demands of life. Courage allows one to face danger without being ruled by fear. Temperance allows one to enjoy pleasure without being enslaved by it. Justice allows one to live in community without fragmentation or resentment. Each virtue strengthens the individual's ability to act consistently across changing circumstances. Importantly, Aristotle did not deny the role of external goods. Health, friendship, security, and sufficient resources matter, but they matter as supports, not as foundations. A person lacking character cannot be saved by good fortune, while a person with character can remain intact even when fortune turns. This is why Aristotle held that happiness is resilient rather than fragile. Time plays a central role in this vision. Flourishing is visible only in retrospect, as a pattern of choices that form a recognizable life. Individual setbacks do not negate it, just as individual successes do not guarantee it. What matters is the overall direction, whether reason governs desire, whether action aligns with purpose, whether growth continues despite disruption. This perspective reframes adversity. Difficulty becomes a test of structure rather than a threat to happiness itself. A flourishing life can absorb strain because it is built on capacities that strain reveals rather than destroys. Even loss does not fully dismantle meaning, because meaning resides in how one lives, not merely in what one has. In this way, Aristotle's concept of eudaimonia offers a demanding but durable vision of the good life. It does not promise constant pleasure or emotional ease. It promises coherence, stability, and depth. A life that flourishes is not one that feels good at every moment, but one that makes sense as a whole. Chapter 3. Character is formed by habit. Aristotle also emphasized that habit works in both directions. Just as good actions build virtue, poor actions build vice. There is no neutral ground. Every repeated behavior strengthens a tendency, either toward excellence or away from it. This is why small choices matter more than dramatic ones. What is practiced daily outweighs what is attempted occasionally. Character is not shaped by rare moments of intensity, but by the quiet consistency of ordinary conduct. This insight reframes moral failure. Vice is not primarily a matter of bad intentions, but of badly trained habits. A person who reacts impulsively has not failed in reasoning alone. They have rehearsed impulsivity. In the same way, self-control is not a heroic act performed under pressure, but the result of countless prior acts performed when the stakes were low. By the time a decisive moment arrives, character is already in motion. Aristotle was particularly attentive to timing. Habits form most easily early, when behavior is still flexible and responses are not yet fixed. This is why education and upbringing mattered so deeply in his ethics. But he did not believe character was frozen after youth. Change remains possible, though it requires greater effort. Old habits resist replacement, not because change is impossible, but because repetition has given them weight. Importantly, Aristotle did not suggest blind routine. Habits must be guided by reason if they are to form virtue rather than mere conformity. Repetition without direction produces rigidity, not excellence. Virtue requires that actions be chosen knowingly, for their own sake, and in accordance with right judgment. Habit supplies stability, reason supplies aim. This is why Book 2 introduces the doctrine of the mean. Virtue lies not in extremes, but in proportion, between excess and deficiency, relative to the individual and the situation. Habit trains sensitivity to this balance. Over time, the virtuous person does not calculate each response laboriously. They perceive what is appropriate and act accordingly. Judgment becomes intuitive because it has been practiced. From this perspective, character is not a mask worn in public, but a disposition expressed spontaneously. One does not need to summon virtue under pressure. One simply acts as one has been trained to act. This is the highest achievement of habit, not obedience to rules, but the internalization of order. Aristotle's lesson is uncompromising and practical. If one wishes to change who one is, one must change what one repeatedly does. Reflection may guide the process, and intention may initiate it, but only sustained action completes it. Identity, in the Aristotelian sense, is not discovered. It is constructed one habit at a time. Chapter 4: The Golden Mean and the Problem of Extremes. Aristotle's emphasis on balance was not a call for caution, born of fear, but for strength guided by intelligence. Extremes often masquerade as commitment. They feel decisive, even virtuous, because they demand sacrifice. Yet Aristotle saw that excess usually reflects impatience, a desire for rapid transformation without regard for sustainability. Deficiency, by contrast, reflects avoidance, the refusal to engage fully with what life requires. Both miss the mark because both distort effort. The mean preserves agency. A person acting with balance remains capable of adjustment. They can increase effort when conditions demand it and restrain themselves when restraint is required. Extremes remove this flexibility. Once committed to excess, one must either continue or collapse. Once settled into deficiency, one must either awaken suddenly or stagnate indefinitely. Balance keeps the individual responsive rather than rigid. This is why Aristotle linked virtue so closely with perception. The virtuous person does not follow rigid rules. They see situations clearly. They recognize when fear is appropriate and when it is limiting. They sense when rest restores capacity and when it erodes it. This sensitivity is not innate. It is trained through repeated engagement with real situations. Balance is learned by correcting excess and deficiency over time. Aristotle also understood that imbalance often arises from misidentified goods. When recognition is treated as essential, ambition escalates into anxiety. When comfort is treated as safety, rest hardens into avoidance. The golden mean reorders these goods, allowing them to serve life rather than dominate it. Effort becomes directed, not compulsive. A life governed by the mean develops resilience. Because it avoids extremes, it does not depend on ideal conditions. It can absorb disruption without losing form. Setbacks become manageable rather than catastrophic. Progress continues, not in dramatic leaps, but in steady accumulation. This is the kind of life Aristotle admired, not spectacular, but reliable. Importantly, Aristotle did not suggest that balance eliminates struggle. On the contrary, finding the mean often requires resisting powerful impulses toward excess or deficiency. Balance demands more discipline than indulgence, and more courage than withdrawal. It is harder to sustain than either extreme, which is why it produces greater stability. In the end, the golden mean is not about moderation for its own sake. It is about accuracy in living. To live well is not to live timidly or intensely, but fittingly, to meet each situation with the level of engagement it truly requires. Such a life may lack drama, but it gains endurance. And for Aristotle, endurance was a mark of genuine excellence. Chapter 5. Reason as the governing principle. Aristotle believed that the defining feature of human life is not strength, emotion, or instinct, but reason. In Nicomachean Ethics, Book 1, he argues that every being has a function, and the human function is activity of the soul in accordance with reason. Desire reacts to immediate sensation. It seeks relief, comfort, and pleasure in the present moment. Reason, by contrast, has the ability to look across time. It weighs consequences. It considers coherence. This capacity to let reason guide desire is, for Aristotle, what separates a directed life from a reactive one. When desire governs, life becomes unstable. In Book 3, Aristotle explains that actions driven primarily by impulse lack deliberation. Short-term relief is prioritized over long-term stability. Decisions begin to contradict values. What feels good now undermines what matters later. Effort becomes impulsive rather than intentional. Energy is spent reacting to circumstance instead of shaping it. Over time, this pattern produces inner conflict, because the person is no longer acting in a way that makes sense to the rational part of the soul. Aristotle did not believe reason was meant to suppress emotion entirely. Instead, he believed emotion could be educated. In Book 2, he explains that virtue involves feeling the right emotion at the right time for the right reason. When reason governs, emotion does not disappear. It becomes trained. Desire begins to align with values. What once required force begins to feel natural. Action gains consistency because it is no longer dependent on mood. In Book 6, Aristotle introduces phronesis, or practical wisdom, the capacity to apply reason to live situations. This form of reason is not abstract logic. It is judgment developed through experience. Practical wisdom allows a person to recognize what is appropriate in a given moment. It integrates desire, emotion, and thought into a single direction. Without it, knowledge remains theoretical and ineffective. This is why Aristotle defined freedom in a way that contrasts sharply with modern assumptions. Freedom is not unlimited choice or absence of constraint. It is self-governance. A person ruled by impulse is not free, even if no external force is present. A person ruled by reason, even under constraint, retains inner freedom. True freedom is the ability to act according to what is right, rather than what is immediately easy. Aristotle's vision of freedom is demanding but stable. It does not promise comfort. It promises coherence, and coherence, sustained over time, is what allows a life to be lived deliberately rather than reactively. Chapter 6. Virtue as Practice and Training. For Aristotle, virtue is not something a person owns like a possession. It is something a person does. In Nicomachean Ethics, Book 2, he is explicit that virtue exists only in action. Courage exists only when fear is confronted. Honesty exists only when truth is spoken despite risk. Justice exists only when fairness is practiced in real situations. Outside of action, virtue remains theoretical and unformed. This understanding completely changes how difficulty is interpreted. Resistance is no longer an interruption to a good life. It becomes the condition that makes virtue possible. Aristotle argued that without challenge, there is no opportunity to act well. Avoiding difficulty may reduce discomfort, but it also weakens character. In Book 3, he explains that virtues like courage and temperance are revealed only in moments of pressure. Without pressure, they cannot be exercised or strengthened. Aristotle frequently compared moral development to physical training. Just as muscles grow through resistance, character grows through effort. Ease does not build strength. Comfort does not refine judgment. A good life, therefore, is not one without struggle, but one in which struggle is met with the right kind of response. Difficulty becomes meaningful when it is understood as participation in one's own formation. This perspective also explains why excellence decays without use. Virtue is not self-sustaining. If it is not practiced, it weakens. A person who once acted courageously but repeatedly avoids challenge gradually loses that capacity. Aristotle believed character is dynamic. It either strengthens through use or deteriorates through neglect. There is no neutral state. For Aristotle, the highest form of life is active, not passive. It is a life in which effort is not resented, but recognized as necessary. Virtue in this sense is not heroic in rare moments. It is quiet and persistent in ordinary ones. It is practiced daily, often without recognition, in choices that require restraint, patience, and resolve. Without challenge, excellence fades. With resistance, character is refined. Aristotle did not promise a life without struggle. He described a life made strong by it. Chapter 7. Purpose as function, not passion. Purpose, then, is not a feeling to be chased, but a direction to be lived. It does not announce itself with excitement or certainty. It reveals itself gradually through sustained effort. Passion may ignite interest, but it cannot sustain a life. What endures is commitment, the willingness to return to a task even when enthusiasm fades. Aristotle understood purpose through ergon, the proper work of a thing. A knife fulfills its purpose not by wanting to cut, but by cutting well. In the same way, a human life gains meaning not by imagining significance, but by exercising reason in service of excellence. Purpose emerges when thought is joined to action, and intention is disciplined by reality. This is why responsibility precedes fulfillment. Taking on obligation forces attention outward, away from the self and toward what must be done. In meeting real demands, solving problems, serving others, building something that lasts, human capacity is shaped and clarified. One learns what one is for by being needed. Purpose also resists immediacy. It unfolds over time, deepening as skill deepens and judgment matures. Early efforts are often clumsy, unclear, and unrewarding. Yet through repetition, competence grows, and with competence comes a quiet sense of rightness. Meaning follows mastery, not the reverse. Aristotle did not promise happiness through comfort. He described eudaimonia as flourishing through activity in accordance with virtue. This kind of fulfillment is not passive pleasure, but active alignment. It arises when a person lives in harmony with their capacities, their duties, and the world they inhabit. In the end, purpose is not something one has. It is something one does, and it becomes stronger, clearer, and more meaningful the more fully it is practiced. Chapter 8 is consistency over intensity. Aristotle never trusted enthusiasm on its own. In Nicomachean Ethics, Book 2, he makes it clear that excellence is not the result of sudden effort, but of repeated action over time. Virtue, he argues, is formed in the same way any skill is formed, by doing the same kind of act again and again until it becomes stable. Intensity may create movement, but it does not create form. Only repetition does. This is why Aristotle valued time more than excitement. Time exposes whether an action is rooted in character or merely driven by emotion. Intensity feels powerful because it is visible. It announces itself. It produces immediate sensation. But Aristotle understood that what matters most in life is not what feels powerful in the moment, but what endures. Actions done occasionally, no matter how dramatic, do not shape the soul. Actions done regularly, even when small, quietly reorganize it. This is why Aristotle repeatedly emphasized habituation. The soul learns not through peaks, but through patterns. In Book 1, Aristotle explains that a life cannot be judged by isolated moments because life unfolds across time. Progress, therefore, often feels invisible in its early stages. Nothing appears to change. Effort seems unrewarded. This invisibility causes many to abandon discipline prematurely. Aristotle saw this not as failure of ability, but as misunderstanding of how human development works. Growth happens beneath awareness first. Only later does it become visible. Time for Aristotle is a filter. It reveals seriousness. Anyone can act intensely for a short period. Few are willing to act consistently without immediate reward. What persists slowly reshapes character. What is abandoned leaves no trace. This is why Aristotle believed that a stable life is not built through bursts of effort, but through sustained practice. Stability is not exciting, but it is powerful. In Book 10, Aristotle returns to this idea by emphasizing that the highest human activities are those that can be maintained over a lifetime. A life built on intensity burns out. A life built on consistency deepens. Consistency turns intention into structure. Structure turns effort into identity. Over time, what was once difficult becomes natural, and what was once forced becomes chosen. Aristotle did not believe greatness came from doing extraordinary things once. He believed it came from doing ordinary things well, repeatedly, across time. What persists grows. What grows shapes character, and character, over time, determines the quality of life. Chapter 9, Responsibility as the Source of Meaning. Aristotle was very precise about where responsibility begins. In Nicomachean Ethics, Book 3, he makes a crucial distinction between what is voluntary and what is involuntary. Actions done under force or ignorance do not fully belong to the person, but actions chosen knowingly, even under difficulty, shape character. Meaning, in Aristotle's view, can only arise from what is voluntary. If life is experienced as something that merely happens, meaning collapses. Meaning appears only where ownership begins. This is why comfort and avoidance feel empty. Comfort removes pressure, but it also removes authorship. Avoidance may reduce pain in the short term, but it strips life of agency. Aristotle understood that a human being cannot respect a life that feels accidental. Blame, whether directed outward or inward, dissolves responsibility. And without responsibility, action loses weight. Effort feels pointless because it does not feel chosen. Aristotle believed responsibility reorganizes identity because it reestablishes causality. To take responsibility is to accept being the cause of one's actions. In Book 3, he emphasizes that character itself is shaped by repeated voluntary choices. Over time, these choices solidify into disposition. This is why responsibility is not just moral, it is structural. It turns scattered actions into a coherent pattern. When effort feels owned, it no longer feels imposed. Hardship stops feeling like punishment and starts feeling like participation. Dignity for Aristotle is not pride or status. It is the quiet stability that comes from acting in accordance with one's own reason. A responsible person experiences inner calm, not because life is easy, but because actions are intelligible. There is no constant internal argument about why something must be done. The reason is clear. Responsibility removes inner conflict by aligning action with understanding. Aristotle never suggested that meaning is discovered through reflection alone. In fact, he repeatedly warned that ethical understanding without action is incomplete. Meaning is not found like an object. It is assumed through commitment. It appears when a person willingly binds effort to consequence. When life is treated as something to be carried rather than avoided, meaning emerges as a natural result. In Book 10, Aristotle argues that the highest form of human life is one lived deliberately, guided by reason. Such a life does not escape responsibility, it embraces it. Responsibility is not a burden added to life, it is what makes life feel real. Without it, even success feels hollow. With it, even difficulty carries weight. Meaning, then, is not a reward given by circumstances, it is the result of standing behind one's actions. Final chapter. Why direction changes everything. Aristotle repeatedly returned to one central insight. Human life unfolds over time, and therefore cannot be judged by isolated moments. Habits, character, and outcomes do not transform suddenly because they are formed through repetition. A life, in his view, is a structure built gradually through action. This is why sudden motivation rarely changes anything lasting. Motivation fades, but patterns remain. What can change quickly, however, is the aim toward which actions are directed. When the aim changes, the meaning of every action changes with it. In Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle explains that actions take their character from their end. The same effort, when directed toward different ends, produces entirely different lives. Hard work aimed at approval produces anxiety. Hard work aimed at excellence produces dignity. Rest aimed at escape produces stagnation. Rest aimed at restoration produces strength. Direction does not eliminate effort. It gives effort a coherent role within a larger whole. Once the mind understands what it is working toward, scattered actions begin to organize themselves naturally. Clarity for Aristotle is not emotional excitement or sudden certainty. It is intellectual orientation. It is knowing what kind of life is being built and why certain actions belong within it. When this clarity appears, habits stabilize because they now serve a visible purpose. Discipline no longer feels like punishment. It feels like alignment. Time, which once felt like an enemy, begins to compound quietly. Small actions gain weight because they are no longer random. They are contributions to a defined way of living. Aristotle never promised ease. In fact, he warned repeatedly that a good life would involve effort, resistance, and restraint. What he promised instead was intelligibility, a life that makes sense from the inside, a life where actions are not constantly at war with values, a life where effort, though demanding, feels justified. Clarity reorganizes life not by removing struggle, but by placing struggle in service of something meaningful. Final thought. Life does not change in 45 minutes. Character does not rebuild itself instantly. Habits do not disappear on command. But understanding can arrive in a moment. And once understanding is present, actions begin to line up. Choices gain consistency. Time begins to work differently. Aristotle believed the highest human achievement was not pleasure nor success, but living in accordance with reason. When reason provides direction, life does not become easier. It becomes coherent. And a coherent life, even when difficult, moves forward with purpose.